Hi, I'm Dr. Kelly Palfy. I'm a registered psychologist. I'm also a retired police lady, and I specialize in working with adult male survivors of sexual abuse. I actually researched the subject and wrote a book about it. And today I'm here to talk about male sexual abuse and the prevalence because I believe it's a very hidden epidemic. So by means of getting started, or by ways of getting started, I'd like everyone to think about a boy or man in your life that you think might possibly be a male survivor of sexual abuse. Could be your cousin, maybe your nephew, maybe your best friend's brother or something like that. That man that, sort of took a different path in life, maybe went off the rails a little bit, maybe kind of turned to alcohol or drugs and maybe even a life of crime, which doesn't make any sense to you because you saw the way he was brought up. He was brought up in a good home. Now, he's probably never going to have said to you that he was a survivor of sexual abuse, but research does show that if he was abused, he's probably never told anybody that he was. Although the research is now dated, anonymous research conducted shows that males are sexually assaulted at a rate of approximately 1 out of every 6 males. We know that females are assaulted at a rate about 1 of every 3. As a former police lady and as a researcher, I know that only about 8% of crimes account for male sexual abuse. So we know that the prevalence of sexual abuse is about half as much as the woman, but the degree of reporting is only about 8%. So we got to ask ourselves, why is this if we know it's existing? By now, I suspect you might be wondering why me as a woman am advocating for male survivors of sexual abuse, since I'm clearly not one. Like I mentioned earlier, I became aware of this situation when I was a police lady. I first became familiar with males as victims of sexual abuse when I was working in the Integrated Child Sexual Exploitation Unit in the RCMP. So in the early 2000s, we started up this program in response to a problem that already existed. Briefly, in the US, a postal service worker noticed that there was an unusually large number of suspicious packages all coming from the same location that were going out. So they got curious about all these packages, and in collaboration with the Department of Homeland Security, they conducted a joint investigation. They opened a few of these packages, and what they discovered was that they all contained child pornographic images. These images were all purchased via credit card. So they furthered their investigation and obtained all of the credit card numbers and names of all the offenders who had purchased these illicit images. Then they told us about that. So if memory serves me correctly, we had about 350 Canadians that were on that list, about 90 of which lived in British Columbia, which is where I was living at the time. So we researched how to investigate these crimes. Then we established a unit and we started to teach other agencies within BC how to do the same thing, how to investigate these offenses, the ones that were occurring in their jurisdiction. So during that time, the RCMP was training me to be a subject matter expert. And on one of my many training courses, Sheldon Kennedy came and gave us a private lecture. Now, for anybody who's not familiar with Sheldon Kennedy, he's a former pro hockey player, and he was one of the first males to ever come forward and speak publicly about male sexual abuse. So he came and gave us seasoned sex crimes investigators a private lecture about his abuse. He talked about how his abuse, how it got started, where it took place, and how. And he also talked about why he didn't talk about his abuse sooner. He said, he had been raised in poverty, and his new career was literally lifting his family out of poverty. He also knew that his parents were super proud of him. His parents were proud of him, the community was proud of him. He just didn't want to disappoint people. Plus, he believed in himself. He knew he had the skill set to go pro, and he knew his coach, Graham James, had the means to get him to where he wanted to go. So he knew also that if he reported his abuse, that his chances of making the NHL were minimized. He also told us about how he believed, this was the one that really broke my heart. He said he thought that other parents of his teammates knew, or at least should have known, that he was being sexually abused, but did nothing. That broke my heart. I could not believe that. I could not believe that a parent would ignore childhood sexual abuse and put their own personal child's needs above another child. I mean, it just blew my mind. And my heart really went out to Sheldon Kennedy, and I started to think about all the other men that might be in his situation. Prior to being a police officer, I was a corrections officer. And at that time, I remember working in prisons and wondering, why are there so many men in prison? I mean, compared to women, why so many men? And when Sheldon Kennedy started talking about how he'd turned to alcohol and drugs, I started to see that maybe there were other men that might be in this situation that would turn to alcohol and drugs, and I knew that was a slippery slope. I wanted to do more to help him, but here I was working in the child sexual exploitation unit, and we were being bombed with files that were coming in. I mean, we were overloaded. Another thing that Sheldon Kennedy talked about was this. He said he was living a double life. That's the piece that I really related to, because in some ways I was living a double life too. I mean, here I was on the top of my game career-wise, working in major crimes, but I was being bullied. And I mean, there were times when I would run out of the room and go to the exhibit locker and bawl my eyes out, and I was crying almost every day by the time I got home after work, and I was just shutting down physically. I mean, I was just being tormented. I could not handle the abuse, but yet I felt powerless to stop it. And I mean, I was a police lady with a badge and a gun, and he was a kid. He was 15 years old. I had my career established. He didn't have that yet. So my heart just really went out to him. And there I was in school, and one day one of my professors mentioned that he worked at this place called the BC Society for Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse. And it was like this little light went on inside of me, and I just remembered Sheldon Kennedy's lecture. I remembered how passionate I'd felt about wanting to do more. And I started to think, with my background in policing and what I'd seen, maybe I could make a difference for boys and men. I just decided to pursue it. If you're still not convinced that male sexual abuse is as prevalent as I am trying to say that it is, you don't have to take just my word for it. The RCMP website shows that there's over 700 sex offender registry sites in Canada alone. That's 43,000 sex offenders that are living outside of custody in Canada at any given time. That's approximately one offender for every 850 people in Canada. We know from what offenders tell us that offenders have on average 150 victims each across their lifetime. That's a lot of male victims living in Canada. Another statistic that should be of concern to us is that in Canada, males are known to complete suicide at a rate of 3.5 times more frequently than females. Could this be because there's a hidden epidemic? Research out of Iceland, titled Deep and Unbearable Consequences of Childhood Sexual Abuse, supports this. As the title implies, the researchers looked at the consequences of childhood sexual abuse. They took a sample of 14 Icelandic men who had all been sexually abused and who had all lived with a profound sense of depression their entire lives. Each of these men said nothing until they got to this place in their life where they were either going to report their abuse or kill themselves. I personally believe that at least part of the reason why these statistics are so much higher than females, males don't have the same resources as females do to help them navigate trauma and sexual abuse. Part of the reason for this, of course, is because we know that males don't talk about sexual abuse. Research shows that boys and men will not talk about things that they don't hear other boys and men talking about. So the good news is you and I get to be part of the solution. By being here, by having these conversations, we are creating awareness and we are making it safe for boys and men to come forward.